1964 steering committee, and that was a program on Chancellor Aycock and President Bill Friday, and how they helped shape the course for today's university. We have three wonderful speakers, and I'm going to take this moment to introduce them. I'll just give brief bios for them all, and then I'll turn the program over to them. And then I'm going to introduce them in the order they plan to speak. Starting from the far end of the stage is Steve Channing, who got his PhD here from Carolina in '68. He brings a wide range of experiences as a historian, author, and Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. He began his professional life as an academic historian, and his first publication, Crisis of Fear, received the Allen Nevins Prize. He's taught at Kentucky, Stanford, and Duke, was a Fulbright Fellow in Genoa, Italy, and was a research fellow at Johns Hopkins. Beginning in the 1980s, he began to tell stories about the American past through documentary and educational television through his company Video Dialogue, Inc. His initial productions included American's 40th Anniversary, narrated by Andy Griffith, and Loyalty on Trial, an American Bar Association prize winner, and Alamance, on the protests that helped lead to the American Revolution. Alamance was a regional Emmy Award winner. Since then, his PBS broadcast films include February 1 on the Greensboro sit-ins, Durham, a self-portrait, Change Comes Knocking on Governor Sanford's anti-poverty efforts, and Down Home on Jewish life in North Carolina. Along with his new film on North Carolina's greatest generation, Dr. Channing is completing Remarkable Journey on the story of immigrants from India to our state. Next, we have the Dean of the Law School, Jack Boger, who got his law degree from Carolina in '74. He joined the UNC School of Law faculty in 1990 and has served as its dean since 2006. After completing his law degree here, he clerked with the Honorable Samuel Silverman of the New York Supreme Court Appellate Division and was a litigator in a New York City firm for 3 years. In 1978, Jack joined the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he litigated capital punishment cases for a decade, becoming in 1983 the director of the fund's Capital Punishment Project. And in 1987, he became director of a legal defense fund poverty and justice program, established to enlarge the legal rights of the minority poor. He's taught at Harvard, New York Law School, and Florida State University. Jack teaches constitutional law, education law, and racial discrimination and poverty law. And finally, the Honorable Willis Whichard, we know him as Bill Whichard around the GAA, class of '62 and his law degree here in '65, has the distinction of being the only person in the history of North Carolina who has served in both houses of the state legislature and on both of the state's appellate courts. Bill began his legal career as a clerk to New York Supreme Court Justice and later Chief Justice William H. Bobbitt. From 1966 to 1980, he practiced law in Durham and entered politics, being elected first to the North Carolina House of Representatives and then to the North Carolina Senate. In 1980, he was appointed by Governor Jim Hunt to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, where he served until he became a justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court in 1986. He retired from the court in 1998 and served as dean of the Norman Adrian Wiggins School of Law at Campbell University from 1999 until his retirement as dean in 2006, when he returned to the practice of law. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over and enjoy the program.
Thanks, Ann Louise. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Speak up louder, speak up. I like being behind the camera rather than in front of it. Welcome, thanks for coming to this session. What a tough act to follow, though, to have a session right after that beautiful one on Coach Smith. I'm sure a lot of you were there for that. But I think we can at least equal the significance of the coach in the story that we're going to talk about. I have the great honor of being asked almost 9 years ago initially to do a biographical film about Bill Friday. did a series of interviews with Bill and with other members of his cabinet, and also with Chancellor Aycock. During those years, due to health problems and other issues, the project was put on hold, but then it began again thanks to Bill coming to me and saying, let's restart this, but I have enough buildings named for me. I don't need another monument. Let's do a film about those of us of that generation, North Carolina's own greatest generation. About a year and a half, I guess, ago, and Bill has heard this story, I went into my favorite dry cleaner here in Chapel Hill. A lot of you know the Closet Cleaners on Elliott Road. Used to be Bill Friday there all the time. He also did his shirts there. And I came in one morning, and everyone behind the counter was crying. And I was taken aback. What on earth has happened? And Bill Friday had passed that morning. It was University Day. And I felt a great weight fall on me, a feeling of responsibility to have this opportunity to talk about Bill and Bill Aycock, Bill Friday, Bill Aycock, and their generation. I'd like to show you a little bit of the story that we're going to be telling. It'll be on UNC television, I hope, later this year. It's called Generation of Change. It's about Bill Friday, Bill Aycock, Terry Sanford, and the others of their generation who, almost all of them born in small towns across North Carolina, experienced the Depression, went to war, came home with the resolve to make this what became the Dixie Dynamo, what became the progressive leader in the South and in the nation. So the film will pick up right at the beginning of the war with the reference to Pearl Harbor and take us through the formation of the famed law school study group. So please roll the film.
The attack on Pearl Harbor silenced this debate for a time, as the nation geared up to fight a massive two-front world war in Europe and the Pacific. For North Carolina's greatest generation, it was a transformational experience.
I told my wife when I heard it over the radio that they'd bombed Pearl Harbor, I said, well, get out my officer's uniform, which I had while I was at state. I said, it'll still fit. And as soon as the IBM cranks out those cards on me, I'll be on the way.
The World War II was, it really, in a way, marked the beginning of modern American economy, particularly a knowledge economy, a high-tech economy. You think about the war and the role that science played in it, obviously, and the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, and new technologies like radar. And you saw in places around the country the important role that universities were going to have in driving that economy forward and taking the knowledge produced in the universities and turning it into sort of new technologies that changed American life.
The war had a tremendous impact on North Carolina, more so than most states.
Fayetteville, the home of Fort Bragg, one of the largest Army posts in the world.
You're going to get all of these military installations that are going to be built. So there's a lot of construction work. Secondly, you're going to get thousands and thousands of people who come to North Carolina, who are going to live here, who are going to buy goods, building up the economic prowess of the state.
The war was also a catalyst for change in the lives of African Americans. Fighting fascism overseas made them question segregation at home. Racial tensions were running high. Bill Friday, stationed at the Navy's huge ordnance facility in Norfolk, remembers one evening when frustrations finally boiled over.
It was then that we began the integration of the Navy. The Coca-Cola Company had a tradition then of sending orchestras around to different camps to play for the servicemen. And one came to our place.
Only white personnel were invited to the rehearsal performance. which angered the African American servicemen.
And while the first show was going on, we used to have these huge porcelain cups for coffee. All of those disappeared from the mess halls and were thrown into the windshields, and glass broke the windows of all the cars they could find that belonged to these people. Knives cut the tires. It was a real rebellion. What was so dramatic was that we had so many young officers there together, some 40 of us, and I would venture to say maybe 2 or 3 of us had ever worked with any person of African American descent. They really didn't know what to do. It was a paralyzing kind of an experience, because there it was, as raw and dramatic as you could make it.
May of 1945 saw the lights go on again.
The war's end brought a flood of GIs and officers home, eager to resume their civilian lives.
Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. There was still
What happened there is that that generation grew impatient with the status quo. We were lucky. We were the ones who got back. World War II, you remember, had a very high casualty rate. And you didn't talk about this, but you knew you were really lucky in most every instance. So you never lose sight of that. You don't talk about it. You don't wear it on your sleeve, but it's inside your soul, and you know it. And you look around and you want to do something. You don't want to see that happening again.
I was pretty close to Governor Sanford, and I don't know how many times he said to me, after World War II, nothing was hard for me. He said the worst days as governor, president of Duke, U.S. Senator, I drew back on that experience, and by comparison, it was easy. And I think that was true not just of him, but of that entire generation.
I mean, you lose 4 years, and many of us were married, and some of us had children. I had a little son and my wife, Grace, and I was 30 years old, and it was time to go to work, and that's what I did.
Resolved to make up for those lost years, many key future state leaders chose to attend the University of North Carolina Law School at Chapel Hill.
I met Bill Friday in the classroom early after we got back. It was a very small group of us that got back that quickly. And he and I just happened to take a seat beside each other. And we've never separated since then. We've been a part of each other's lives. And actually, I think one thing that played a big part in it was that we early formed a study group. It was composed of Bill Friday, who of course became president of the university, Bill Aycock, who became a law professor and then chancellor at Chapel Hill, Dixon Phillips, who became dean of the law school and then a federal judge, Bill Dees, a lawyer from Goldsboro, who was the first chairman of the Board of Governors, and with Bill molded the system into what it is today, and then myself.
And it was here that they came under the influence of UNC's charismatic president, Dr. Frank Porter Graham, and dedicated their lives to public service.
Frank Graham was a critically important figure in the life of this university. He championed the university as a forum for open debate, for sharing ideas, and he championed the university as a place for the critical self-examination of the Southern way of life. And I think he also understood the potential power of the university as an engine of both economic and social change, that over time could and would make North Carolina a more prosperous and a more just society.
Like everyone else, I was tremendously influenced by Dr. Graham, who was the president of the university, and he was a great driving force for justice and what in those days we would have called with pride a liberal attitude.
He inspired you to do things. He was a man who was utterly unselfish. He was always teaching you. Being in the law school at that particular time, you quickly got absorbed into what was happening in the state. If you had any interest in public service, you were involved in the good health program or in doing something about the schools or in doing something about this or that that needed to be done.
My job this afternoon is fairly circumscribed. I'm supposed to pick up from 1948 and carry the lives of these two men forward until 1958, when young Bill Whichard arrives as a first-year student and undergraduate at Chapel Hill. So let me tell those stories, the two stories of Bill Friday and Bill Aycock during that period. As you heard, student body president Bill Friday had finished the war, come back to Chapel Hill with Ida, his wife, completed law school in 2 years by taking summer school classes, and graduated in June of 1948. He passed the bar, but it was a tough time, not a good job market, and he hadn't been a very top student, a good student, but not one of the very highest. He hoped, he thought, to be a corporate lawyer in a textile manufacturing company. He didn't really think he liked public speaking or courtroom work. That's our Bill Friday. So he went over to Burlington Industries to interview for a job, and it didn't go well. He didn't get the offer. He came back uncertain about what to do and found that 3 people had spoken up for him. Albert Coates, who ran the Institute of Government, Chancellor Robert House at UNC, and Dr. Frank Porter Graham. They had all said, we are impressed with the potential of this young man. Let's make him Assistant Dean of Students. Bill Friday said it had never occurred to him to do any work in the university. Indeed, he realized it was a risk to move away from law, in which he had just obtained his degree, and head off into this uncertainty. But he took the opportunity and became the Assistant Dean in South Building in 1948. Apparently, because of his great sort of skill as a student body president, they put him in charge of student affairs and student government. And he was described as a tough but understanding dean. Indeed, he worked with the Chapel Hill Police Force. There were a lot of soldiers that come back that were fairly boisterous as undergraduates. And there's a story, for example, of a Daily Tar Heel editor who took a drunken drive several times around the old well in his car. It was all fully documented, but no line of court, no permanent suspicion. Instead, Dean Friday called him into his office, said, I've heard a report that something's going on around the old well. We aren't going to do that again, are we? And out the student went, relieved at that kind of treatment. He was a wonderful dean, apparently, and hoped to begin to expand his horizons. And Dr. Graham said, I want you to be my driver. I don't drive. And I go to a lot of speeches around the state. Can you come with me? Plainly wanting to mentor him. And indeed, not only did he go to speeches, but he and Billy Carmichael went over to the state legislature to lobby on behalf of the University of North Carolina. When Frank Porter Graham in 1949, in March, was suddenly appointed to the United States Senate by the governor after Mel Broughton's untimely death, it was really a bombshell that rocked the campus at Chapel Hill. And Friday candidly thought he would be going to Washington with Dr. Frank, and was disappointed when he heard him say, no, you need to stay here. This campus needs you. That may have been a blessing for him, because of course a year later, Frank Porter Graham was involved in a Senate re-election campaign where he was vilified on racial and liberal grounds and lost his election. In the meantime, Bill Friday had moved from the Dean of Students office to become the assistant to the new president of the university, Gordon Gray. Gordon Gray was the son of Bowman Gray, a great financier and tobacco family from Winston-Salem. He had been a brilliant student here at Chapel Hill, the valedictorian. He had gone to Yale Law School, become Secretary of the Army, but he was a very, very different kind of person than Frank Porter Graham. Frank Porter Graham was described as being brilliant and incandescent, but relatively unorganized. Gordon Gray, on the other hand, was an Army sort of meticulous, precision kind of person. Some called him cold and reserved, but he taught Bill Friday, he said, over 4 years, severe discipline. The discipline of doing well and getting everything exactly in order. And so when Boyden Gray was called by President Eisenhower in 1956 to come to Washington to join his administration, there was a question about who would take his place as what was now the president of the 3 colleges, Chapel Hill, NC State, Women's College, Consolidated University. Bill Friday was only 35 years old. He had never held any other positions. And they said, why don't you take the job for a couple of months while we look for somebody permanently? But the trustees apparently disagreed about who should get that position. And Bill Friday had stepped into a couple of very tricky situations, including one in Greensboro. We had to let go Edward Kidder Graham Jr., the son of the great Edward Kidder Graham, who'd been Chancellor here in the teens and before he died in 1918. Bill Friday did that work well. Everybody called him steady, wise, decent, the friendly side, if you would, of the Gordon Gray administration. And so the trustees called him to a meeting and said the following: we will make you the president of the university if you agree to the person we've chosen at the University of North Carolina to be the chancellor. Without any hesitation, Bill Friday said no. Anyone chosen to be president of the university should have the right to pick his own team. They said, if you don't do this deal, you don't get this presidency. And he said, good afternoon, gentlemen, and went away. Well, then one of the trustees called and said, I'll help you. I'll make you the chancellor, the president, I'll change my vote if you just give me a couple appointments in the medical school. And he said, I'm not going to do it. And they waited all the way from March until October, and the trustees relented and said, you're the person we want to be president of the University of North Carolina. Some called it his finest hour. But he tells the story that just after he'd been appointed, he was walking across the campus and heard 2 older faculty members talking. And one said, after 18 years of Frank Graham, good Lord, look what we have now. Immediately ahead of him, and Bill Whichard's going to talk about it, laid challenges of NCAA violations at NC State, and serious athletic turmoil there. Within a few years, an unhappy legislature, mad at the university system in general, and Carolina in particular, and the speaker ban crisis that came out of the liberal efforts on the campus to support racial integration. Some would say the history has a way of repeating itself. Meanwhile, back to 1948, and a different story, but one that intersects, was unfolding for Bill Aycock. He was the other NC State student body president in that same study group, because he had been student body president in 1937. Had left NC State, come to Chapel Hill to get a history degree, fascinated by history, and then agreed to teach high school in Greensboro for 2 years. Half a year into that position, he was offered the job in the Roosevelt administration of running the National Youth Administration. A great job, which would put him all over the state. More money? He said, I can't do it. I promised the school system I was going to stay for 2 years, and I've got to stay for 2 years. And so he did stay for 2, and then when he finished, came to the National Youth Administration, joined the Army, as you heard, as the war started. After the war, plunged into academic life at Chapel Hill. He was a brilliant student, first in his class, editor-in-chief. Indeed, Dick Phillips tells this great story. One day in February, there was a hip-deep snow that covered Chapel Hill. Not a thing was moving, not a sound. Dixon Phillips got up about 6:30 or 7, looked out and said to his wife, this is amazing, not a thing is moving. His wife said, well, not entirely. Bill Aycock lived 3 miles out of town. I said, I saw Bill Aycock walking hip deep up the street, headed toward Manning Hall. He was that kind of student. Indeed, toward the end of his time at the law school, one of his professors lost his voice. And Aycock, who I told you was first in his class, and who had been editor-in-chief, was asked to read his lectures for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. Apparently he did a good job, because by May, Dean Whichard came to him and said, there's a faculty position opening up in July. We want you to be that new faculty member. He said, well, I'm really flattered, Dean Whichard, but I don't actually graduate until next February. And they said, we'll hold the position for you. And then he was. He came and became a wonderful teacher. He won 5 teaching awards over the course of his life. And in 1951, and I've heard him tell this story, many of you may have as well, he was asked to accompany Dr. Frank Porter Graham on behalf of the United Nations to travel to a remote part of a disputed territory in the Himalayas, Kashmir, where India and Pakistan were debating, and still are, over who owns that territory. He flew in with Dr. Graham. He worked with UN officials, had a marvelous experience there, and came back and gave 40 or 50 speeches on it. When Henry Brandes stepped down as dean in 1956, they asked him to be temporarily the acting dean. And then in 1957, once Bill Friday had asserted that he was the president of the Consolidated University, Bill Friday asked him to become the chancellor, which he took up. Before him lay academic issues involving athletics. Before him lay issues with the legislature and the speaker ban. Bill Whichard will pick up the story at this point.
As Jack noted, that brings us to September 1958, when I walked onto this campus as a freshman. My father had graduated from the university in the class of 1930, when there were around 2,200 students here. When I came, the number, as I recall it, was somewhere in the 6,500 to 7,000 range. As I was leaving home, my father noted what a shame it was that the place had gotten so big I would not get to know it. On Sunday afternoon of that orientation week, I was walking from Grand Memorial toward the South Building, and I thought I saw a giant. William Clyde Friday passed me going in the other direction with Ida by his side. As I recall it, he nodded his head and said hello, but continued walking at a fairly rapid clip. As I have aged and experienced life at a lot of levels, it has occurred to me that while I thought I was seeing a giant, that was probably a very insecure time in his life. He had just observed his 38th birthday. He had been president of the university for 2 years, preceded by several months as acting president. His selection as president had been unorthodox, while today, with the benefit of hindsight, this seems ridiculous. It had not been universally applauded. An older friend in the university community who died recently once told me she cried all day the day Bill Friday's appointment as the permanent president was announced. The UNC president answered to a powerful and influential board of trustees, chaired by the state's governor, and with a representative from each of the state's 100 counties. On one occasion in those early years, President Friday had gone to a special friend in considerable distress, convinced that he had mishandled a situation and might lose his job over it. The old adage, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown undoubtedly. President Friday was probably not as insecure and uneasy as I was, as a freshman experiencing orientation in a large and strange place. But he was by no means the icon in higher education and in the greater life of North Carolina that he would become. That same week, I encountered William Aycock for the first time. This was not face-to-face, rather I was simply one of a large freshman class, listening somewhat in awe as the Chancellor justice. I remember, though, being greatly impressed with the man, his thinking, and how well he articulated his thoughts. He told us that numerous signs on the campus gave notice that the autumn twilight was approaching, but that those who had been privileged to precede us here would insist that September is the true springtime in Chapel Hill. Our presence meant a renewal of life, accompanied by fresh hopes and higher aspirations. We would enhance the beauty of this place, as surely as Mother Nature would bring forth its physical beauty after its winter slumber. We were here to draw interest on the intellectual, moral, and spiritual capital provided by the work, effort, and sacrifice of many generations. He believed we would accept the challenge and respond to the opportunities, and that is why he could say on our arrival, even as autumn approached, that it meant springtime in Chapel Hill. During most of my time as a student here, it was customary when considering the university's leadership to think of both of these men. Although Friday headed a system then consisting of 3 institutions, the system offices were in Chapel Hill, and he was very much a part of life on this campus. If you were part of the student leadership, he knew you, and you periodically interacted with him. On a Sunday night every spring, he hosted the Order of the Golden Fleece at the President's House to consider with some of the state's and the country's future leaders the problems and possibilities of both the university and the state. These occasions had a steady refrain. A small but influential core of people really ran the state, he would say. They were a mix from the business, professional, and academic community. They might not always determine who would be the governor, but they always did determine who could be the governor. They solicited responsible candidates for lesser positions as well, and saw to it that they had the funding to make their candidacies viable. It was implicit, if not explicit, that your turn might come to serve the state in some way. And if it did, the ancient concept of civic virtue demanded that you do it. You were getting a world-class education in Chapel Hill at considerable expense to the taxpayers, and for that, you owed something back. If I had to define Bill Friday's genius in a single word, it would be inspiration. Governor Hunt said at Friday's memorial service that his greatness lay not just in what he did, but in what he got us to do. There was just something about him that inspired confidence, that made people want to do and do well what he wanted them to do. And he never failed to let people know how deeply he appreciated what they had done. It was this characteristic that enabled him to get from the state legislature pretty much what he wanted for the university. In my 10 years of service in the General Assembly, I did not see President Friday at the legislative building all that often. He was there occasionally for budget hearings and other matters of major import, but most of the time he worked his will by having R.D. McMillan, former House member who was the lobbyist for the university, stop by a legislator's office and say simply, President Friday would like so-and-so on this. Or President Friday thinks such and such should happen with this bill. Because of the force of that greater personality in the background, that was all that was needed. One exception to this was the 1971 reorganization of higher education, which consolidated all the state institutions of higher education into a single system. Friday did not favor this. I do not recall his having publicly opposed it, but again, the message got through that it did not have his blessings. At his death, I heard and read several accounts crediting him with having formed the system. In my view, that is not accurate as to the system's genesis and formation, but it is absolutely accurate to give him credit for making it work once it was formed. Probably the best known instance of President Friday not getting his way with the legislature is the 1963 Speaker Ban law. In this instance, he had no chance. The law, which banned certain speakers from the campuses of the state-supported institutions of higher learning, was introduced without notice and passed both houses in 23 minutes without hearings. For several years, both Friday and Aycock would expend considerable time and energy dealing with the deleterious effects of the law and getting it declared unconstitutional and ultimately repealed. Considered in light of this struggle, Friday's statement to the University Board of Trustees at the meeting in which he was being considered for appointment as president seems especially pressing. He said this: "May I raise first the question of the exercise of responsible freedom by members of the faculty of our institutions and the students in our student bodies. I have learned to respect the importance of the maintenance of an atmosphere of freedom. The freedom to write and speak the truth as responsible members of a university family. And I say to you that a major part of the great influence our institutions have always had in the nation arises from this tradition." One suspects he had shared these beliefs with Aycock, for the two of them worked very much in tandem to remove this flagrant assault on academic freedom. Indeed, by all appearances, the two made a good team in every respect. Chancellor Fairby Taylor once said to me, "Being the chancellor at Chapel Hill is the best job in the state." He paused and added, "if the president will let you do it." When the head of an institution can be trumped by the president of a system, some tension is inevitable. But the tensions between Friday and Aycock at least appeared to be at a minimum. Certainly, Aycock shared with Friday the task of instilling the concept of civic virtue in the university's students. Equally certainly, Aycock's tenure in the Chancellor's office was a time of building the university. In particular, Aycock made the library a priority item from the beginning of his chancellorship, fixing upon it as one of the truly vital centers of the university. This is an alumni gathering, and as we learned an hour ago, most Carolina alums have at least a mild interest in the men's basketball team. Dean Smith, who was honorary, rightly gets the lion's share of credit for laying the foundations of the program's long-term success. But it should not be forgotten that it was Bill Aycock who hired Dean Smith. My version is slightly different from Woody's earlier, but not much. But as Chancellor Aycock has told it to me, Frank McGuire came to his office on a Sunday afternoon to tell him he was resigning as the UNC coach to coach the Philadelphia 76ers professional team. Aycock thanked him for coming by and asked if Smith was around. "Yes," said McGuire. "As a matter of fact, he's outside in my car right now, waiting for me." "Would you mind asking him if he would come in here for a minute?" Aycock replied. Smith came, and Aycock said to him, would you like to be the head basketball coach at the University of North Carolina? Smith said, yes, I would. Well then, you're it. It was not done without forethought, however. McGuire's program had experienced problems with the NCAA, and instead of going with Chancellor Aycock to the NCAA hearings, McGuire had sent Smith. In the process, Chancellor Aycock came to know and appreciate Smith, and I know from his son that he had told his family that if he ever had to hire a basketball coach, it would be Dean Smith. Yesterday, Chancellor Aycock said to me, the best decision he ever made was to marry Grace, but the second best was to hire Dean Smith. As Aycock approached his retirement from the Chancellor's office, Friday said of him, in the more than 20 years that I have known Bill Aycock, I have respected him as a man of character, of integrity, and personal capacity and intellectual stature. In addition to all that, he is one of the hardest working people I have ever known. Simultaneously, more or less, the University Faculty Council said, since William Aycock became Chancellor 7 years ago, the most apparent characteristic of the university has been both in number and complexity of students, faculty, facilities, buildings, and books. He does not say so, but we know that control and direction of our expansion have been influenced by his wisdom, foresight, and common sense. Finally, in this regard, the University Board of Trustees said this: to the guardianship of the state's original seat of learning, Chancellor Aycock brought an acute, a trained, and a disciplined mind. He shaped its educational policy not by evolving abstract theories, but by delineating a consistent pattern of decision in the forthright confrontation of events. To the administrative task, he brought an almost religious belief in work, an exacting thoroughness, and an astute forehandedness. We have seen the skill with which he analyzed, explained, and solved difficult problems. But only those who worked with him closely know how often problems were averted, how often a crisis simply did not happen because events were influenced by his almost uncanny foresight. I'm often asked if Professor Aycock was my teacher. The answer is a resounding yes, despite the fact that I missed the reportedly grand experience of having him in a law school classroom. Chancellor Aycock returned to the UNC Law School from his administrative post in my third and last year. The only course he taught that I could have taken was federal jurisdiction, and I did not take it. If I had, I would have had him for only 2 or 3 weeks because that was the semester in which he became ill and was out for the duration. He was very much my teacher nonetheless. He was the chancellor for 6 of my 7 years here. I was active in student government and other activities, and I learned a good deal from him. The sheer force of his personality, intellect, and example taught to me and many others far more than we could ever have learned just in a classroom. When I was the News and Observer's Tar Heel of the Week a few years ago, I was asked by the reporter doing the story to name some of my mentors. Without hesitation, I listed Bill Aycock among them, notwithstanding the fact that I never heard a word from him in a liberal classroom. The fact is that the entire campus was his classroom. Indeed, perhaps the entire state was. And he taught many of us quite well wherever he was. It is also a fact that I continue to learn from him. Thankfully, at age 98 and a half, he is still with us. For the past 27 years, he has lived in a retirement home near where I live, and over many of those years, I have paid him episodic visits. Last fall, he lost his son and namesake, and I resolved to try to visit him more or less on a monthly basis. At times these days, he can be a bit slow in pulling up and articulating his thoughts, but he is still quite sharp and a veritable library of information about the university and its personalities during this time. I hope and believe these visits have meant a great deal to him. I know they mean a great deal to me. I and we continue to learn from Bill Friday's legacy and its inspiration. But unfortunately, as noted earlier, his physical presence left us on University Day, October 12, 2012. The day before, I had attended a late afternoon lecture at Wilson Library. On the way to my car, I walked by President Friday's house. I, as caretaker, was on the porch shaking out a towel, and I felt a powerful urge to request that she ask President Friday if he could come and speak to me briefly. The manners my mother instilled in me said, no, you don't do that, and I resisted the temptation. The next day, I was at the University Day breakfast for the Distinguished Alumnus Award recipients when Chancellor Holden announced Friday's passing in the early hours of that morning. I truly believe the urge the night before had been a premonition that it might be my last opportunity to see him. Instead, 4 days later, I chose to walk through the cemetery and returning from the library to my car, and I watched a lone man with a large square pole pounding down the dirt on President Friday's grave. Do I regret not having been bolder with the caretaker that night? No, I could see President Friday anytime by calling Virginia Taylor and scheduling an appointment. And observing the normal protocol had clearly been the right thing to do. But would I have preferred to have had that one last conversation with someone who meant so much to the university and the state, and to me personally? Of course, the answer is yes. I had been right when at age 18, I thought Bill Friday was a giant. To the extent that human beings can attain such proportions, he was one, and so was Bill Aycock. We are all deeply in their debt, and extremely fortunate that they came our way. Thank you.
Happy to take questions. Let me tell a Bill Friday story, if I might, while you're coming down, if there's no hand up. I didn't know Bill Friday well, as my two co-panelists did. I had 3 early meetings with him, but to me they told me so much about who he was. I was a young dean, he was the eminence that he was, and we were at a conference together, and he came over to me and said, Boger, you must either be from Moxville or Concord. And I said, well, I'm from Concord. How did you know? He said, well, that's where the Bogers in North Carolina are from. There was a man who knew North Carolina that deeply. I'm not sure what he would have done with Smith or Jones, but Boger was an easier one. The second time we had a moment to talk, he said, your name is John Boger, isn't it? And I said, yes, there's another John Boger who's a lawyer in Concord. And he said, no, but I knew a John Boger at North Carolina State. And I said, I think that was my uncle for whom I was named. He was killed in World War II. He was flying over the Himalayas right in the end part of the war. He said, I knew your uncle very, very well. We were seniors together. Let me sit down and tell you about him. And really for the first time since my father had died in 1974, I got this picture of a young man with great promise who in fact had not made it through the war. I was so touched. And then 3 days later, there was a stir in my outer office. The secretaries were all agog. And in came President Friday. And with him was a copy of the 1941 Agromech, the yearbook of State College. And he had found 8 places in that senior yearbook where my uncle's picture appeared. And he said, here, I've got 2 of these. I want you to have one. That's quite mad. It changed my whole sense of my relationship to my namesake, and it changed my sense of who he was. It deepened. And I think there are lots of people who could tell those kinds of stories.
These beautiful stories about these 2 great men, their personal touch, is something I'm sure a lot of you have experiences like that, but I think it's also important to reiterate where I guess I'm coming from in the film that we're doing. When these guys came back from World War II, North Carolina was a very different place than what we know and love now. It was second to last in public health. It was second to last in support for education. This was the place that originated the expression, "Thank God for Mississippi." That's both amusing, but also a testament to the tremendous impact that these personalities, their leadership, their courage, their vision in combating great resistance in the legislature and out in the countryside to change. They were change makers of the greatest sense. And we are beneficiaries of the legacy that they've given us. And that's really the theme of our film. And I just wanted to also add that to the great personal impact they had on individuals. There was a question.
I'm Charlie Schaffer, and I grew up in Chapel Hill and went to undergraduate and law school here. And I think the presentations you made this afternoon were pretty fabulous. What I want to do is just make a brief reference to a lecture that I heard Bill Aycock give in the law school when I was a third-year law student. And the case was Erie versus Pennsylvania Railroad. There were 150 third-year law students on the second floor of Manning Hall who were taking the course on federal jurisdiction. Chancellor Aycock, he'd been out of the Chancellor's office for probably 10 years. And on this afternoon, I heard, and I think everybody in that classroom heard, the finest lecture that anybody could ever give on any subject. There have been a lot of cases that dealt with diversity of citizenship, and there were a lot of issues that had not been resolved. And this case, the Supreme Court case of Erie versus Pennsylvania Railroad, solved or at least set landmark ways to analyze all these issues. So the Chancellor started at 2 o'clock. You know, afternoon, all these third-year law students probably a little bit sleepy and thinking about what they're going to do on the weekend. But the pace that he built on that lecture started off strong. And we knew we were hearing something strong. And I won't go into all the detail, but I'll simply say this. When we got to, I guess, 2:45, 5 minutes left to go in that class, and he had 2 or 3 very important wrap-up issues to make. He did so in a powerful way, and 200 third-year law students were literally overcome. We had heard, in my judgment, the finest lecture that had ever been given. And he, the bell rang, The students didn't move. We sat still. We did not get up. We were stunned by the excellence of that 50-minute lecture. And he finally put his books in his briefcase, looked around, and he was off put a little bit because we weren't leaving. And we finally began to get up as he was, I think, embarrassed to be up front with nothing going on, nobody saying anything, absolute silence. So he started walking down the middle of the aisle. And the applause of those 200 law students was enormous at the first part of his walk down that aisle, and it built and built and built until he had walked all the way out of that classroom. Now, I've never been I've been blessed. Gosh, I went to Chapel Hill for undergraduate law school and went to a great prep school. I've had many great teachers. But on this occasion, in this event, in that circumstance, to me, Chancellor Aycock hit a level that I've never heard anybody ever hit before. So I just want to second what y'all said.
And for those who don't know, the case itself is dry as dust. You know, it really is. To make something out of very topics is a very...
If I may, I'll tell two brief stories that the first presentation earlier this afternoon, together with this, was in echo what Charlie observed. I too live near Chancellor Aycock. Number one, just to be inspired, just wanted to visit almost without notice. On one of my visits, he told me the story of a phone call that he got from President Wright. He was in Charlottesville at the time, leave to teach there, and President Friday said, I would like you to be the next chancellor. And upon receiving the offer, he said, well, I'll take my turn, but I want you to remember, I'm a teacher. 7 years later, he called President Friday. He said, you may recall from our study group that there's a provision in British law that if you are gone for over 7 years, you are presumed to have passed away, and your spouse is free to move on with her life. I'm approaching those 7 years, and I do not want my colleagues in the law school to conclude that I have passed away. I request the opportunity to return to the classroom. The other story is Dean Smith was not instantaneously Dean Smith. And the occasion came one day, early in his study career, when Chancellor Aycock was visited by a couple of very supportive, financially supportive fans who were troubled about the record. And they said, Chancellor, if you don't replace Coach Smith, we will never make another financial contribution to the university or to its sports program. Chancellor Aycock said, gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, there's one thing I need to tend to. It won't take long, and I'll be right back. So he stepped out, came back in. Said, gentlemen, I just want you to know that I've extended Coach Smith's contract. Are we finished here?
Tell a quick story from my time here that shows that he was very smart, but could also be a little bit devious. The university owned the town water system after that, and it was going to be, the fluoridation process was going to occur. If any of you are old enough to remember, it was very controversial back in this. It was a communist plot and things like that. So Chancellor Aycock, I'm making up the dates, but the point is the same, announced that the fluoridation would take effect on May 10th. But in fact, it took effect on May 1st. Well, they got no calls about it, whatever, and on May 10th, all the calls started coming in about how the water system was poisoning everybody. And Chancellor would just say, well, you know, that's funny. He said, we did this 10 days ago, and we haven't had a single complaint.